of all, thanks all for coming here, and thanks to Team Monica and Christoph for organizing it. I'm quite soft-spoken, so if you don't hear in the back rows, just move forward. And also please excuse and bear with me, as I'm actually recovering from a cold, so I'm going to try to do this, but we'll see how it goes. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is climate policy, and specifically the idea of putting a price on carbon. So my talk is going to take a very sort of political economy perspective as we talk about the real world experience that governments have had with introducing these policies. So just a little bit about me, why am I talking to you today? So I guess I've actually been involved in carbon pricing for about 8 years now. Back in 2009, in the US, there was a pretty big kind of cap and trade or carbon pricing policy that was being proposed and going through Congress. And I was actually involved in undergrad at organizing petitions for it and things like that. Later on, I worked at Thomson Reuters as an analyst. And what we did there is essentially doing research and analysis and consulting for lawmakers and for businesses on carbon pricing, essentially tell them how to design carbon pricing systems and things like that. Really fascinating work. Kind of miss it. And most recently, I actually had the fortunate pleasure to be involved in a consulting project with the Mexican government. Actually, last week I was in Mexico City, meeting with officials and kind of consulting them on options for carbon pricing. At MIT, I'm doing a master's in technology and policy with a lot of you, and also doing research on U.S. climate policy as well. So I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes here about sort of 4 key aspects. First, a really sort of brief introduction into carbon pricing, not necessarily from an economist's perspective, but just carbon pricing in terms of what do people say about it? Is it, how is it being sort of framed in the media? How different people think about it? Then talk about sort of how are carbon prices performing so far around the world? And then moving into the reasons why carbon pricing is performing the way it is, or not performing the way it should be. And finally, kind of some suggestions from me about, where do we go from there, or from here. All right. So the economist perspective about carbon pricing is we love it. This article actually quotes some of our very esteemed professors here at MIT and researchers who basically say, well, yeah, if you want to solve climate change, there's a one-page solution. It's called a carbon price. It will incentivize market players to take into account the carbon emissions they're emitting, etc. I'm not going to go through that today. Actually, Ming Hao did a very good job earlier this week if you were there. We say about economists that for every economist, there's an equal and opposite economist, and they're both wrong. But that's actually not true about carbon pricing. You'll be very hard-pressed to find an economist that doesn't think carbon pricing is a good idea. Even very conservative ones like Gregory Mankiw here, support the idea. Scientists endorse it as well. James Hansen on the right has publicly kind of supported it. Michael Mann, who wrote the book The Madhouse Effect, great book, also kind of brings it up as one example of things that people should support if they want to get involved politically. And then recently also scientists signed a letter publicly supporting an initiative in Washington State during this past election back in November for a carbon tax. Maybe strangely, oil companies support it as well. This is a letter from 6 oil and gas companies, European ones, that sent a letter to the executive secretary of the body of the United Nations that deals with climate change, Christiana Figueres, and they basically said, we want a global price on carbon. And Elon Musk supports the idea as well, but the interesting thing about this tweet is he says, it was in relation to the sort of confirmation hearings for Rex Tillerson And he said, well, Rex Tillerson might not be such a bad guy, he supports a carbon tax. So carbon pricing has essentially kind of become this gauge for how smart you are, how committed you are to climate policy, in a way kind of a precondition to be taken seriously. So how do kind of climate policy wonks think about carbon pricing? Well, if you first start with the big question of how do we solve climate change, this chart is one way to think about it. Essentially on the horizontal axis we have the amount of emission reductions in million tons of CO2. On the vertical axis we have the cost per ton of emissions that it costs to reduce those emissions. And this is quite a typical chart. You might have seen that essentially what we have is sort of three different types of emission reduction efforts that we can take. Over here on the right side there are a lot of things that have a negative cost. They make sense to do. There are things like energy efficiency that just pay themselves off. We don't really need a carbon price to implement them. And these are things that a carbon price actually cannot really incentivize because there are non-financial barriers that prevent market players from implementing these options. Bounded rationality, sort of a lot of different market values that I won't go into right now. Interestingly, in the UK, people are trying to figure out why don't people insulate their attics? It would make so much sense. They would save so much money on heating bills. And they found out that people didn't want to go through the mess in their attic. They had hoarded so much stuff. And no carbon price was going to incentivize them to do that. So there are all these barriers that, so we sort of want energy efficiency and other policies to deal with these things. Then we have a lot of other sort of things we can do in the middle of the chart that cost money, and if we had a carbon price, they would become sort of economically, they would make sense. Like clean energy or sustainable agriculture, and these are sort of things that a carbon price can do and incentivize. And then on the far right, we have things like new technologies that require significant research and development, where a carbon price cannot, feasibly really incentivize it because it would have to be extremely high, and there are also other market failures associated with positive externalities and things like that that I don't want to go into. But essentially, everybody agrees for these things in the middle of the chart, we need carbon pricing. So, if carbon pricing is such a good idea, how are we doing so far? So this shows where there's carbon pricing already. If you look at the chart, basically the blue and green areas are places where there are either cap and trade systems in place or carbon taxes. The yellow areas, which are kind of dominate the chart, are areas where carbon prices are being considered. What that means is that the government may have a commitment to carbon pricing, but there is no law and no official kind of announced start date to when a carbon pricing system would start to be implemented. So China, for instance. So the one observation I want to make about this chart is, there's not much carbon pricing going on. If you look at the U.S., it's sort of one glaring emission from this chart. If we look at other areas in sort of either gray or yellow, a lot of major economies are not actually pricing carbon. So here, this chart shows how many emissions are we actually covering with carbon pricing. So on the vertical axis, you see the percentage of emissions that are being covered by carbon pricing so far. So essentially, what we see is that so far we're covering about 15% of emissions. The big chunk at the end that you see that's the forthcoming Chinese national cap and trade system. This is supposed to come into place in 2017. Personally, I'm a bit skeptical. I think that it's sort of having followed the government and the progress that they've had, it's possible that they'll be delayed, but yeah, at some point in China there will be a cap and trade system, and we'll sort of go up to 25% of global emissions being covered by carbon pricing. And the point I'm trying to make is this is quite limited. It's still not really covering most emissions. So how high are carbon prices so far? So here, essentially, on the vertical axis, we're showing the level of the carbon price in a given jurisdiction. And the horizontal axis is showing how many emissions are being covered by that carbon price. So if you look at the green bars, those represent carbon prices that are sort of implemented as a cap and trade system, and the blue ones are carbon taxes. So one interesting observation is actually most carbon pricing systems, in terms of emissions covered, are cap and trade systems. This is essentially because I think they're more politically feasible. If we look at the European and sort of Californian examples, these are places where governments considered having a carbon tax, but actually found it to be politically infeasible and went for a cap and trade instead. So yeah, if we look at sort of the big chunks here, this is the European cap and trade system, one that I worked on for about 5 years. And then we have sort of California as well, and Korea there. And you know, we have sort of a lot of carbon taxes on the right that are actually quite high, especially in Scandinavia. But what you notice about them is they're very limited in terms of emissions. And that is because they have many exemptions. Essentially, to convince lawmakers to pass these carbon taxes, they had to exempt most energy-intensive industries. One extreme case of that, you know, where you have a lot of exemptions, is South Africa, which has a carbon tax in place, which is actually not being shown here, but the joke about the South African carbon tax is it's so sugar-coated that when you open it, it's all sugar. And I think that's true for a lot of these as well. So if we sort of compare it to what we actually need to address climate change, we can look at, well, the social cost of carbon is a concept economists use to you know, measure how much should carbon cost to really internalize the externality, to sort of really, for the companies to take into account the real damages that they're dealing to the rest of the world by polluting. So according to the EPA, the social cost of carbon is $37 a ton. As we see, this is far above any carbon prices in existence. But you know, the EPA estimate is actually, it can be considered quite low. They use very conservative assumptions and quite dubious sort of presuppositions about what the discount rate is and things like that. We can look at other social cost of carbon estimates, like this is from a study which compiled a lot of estimates from different studies into the median value, and what that is $75 a ton. So that's, again, way up there. And then we can look at what the IPCC says the carbon price would have to be to meet the 2-degree target, or to have a 66% chance of meeting it, and that's around 80 in 2020. So kind of, I guess the conclusion is from this is carbon prices are failing at addressing climate change to the extent that we hoped they would. But I also want to make the point that, you know, there are a lot of positive effects of these carbon prices. For instance, in the European Union, they're raising a lot of revenues for from carbon pricing because they essentially sell permits to businesses, and these revenues are going to renewable energy and energy efficiency. So they're supporting things that are generally helping the climate quite significantly. If we look at something like the British Columbia carbon tax, which is at $30 a ton, studies have shown that it has reduced emissions and at the same time allowing the British Columbia economy to grow faster than other provinces in Canada. So, you know, it's not all bad. I mean, certainly carbon prices are doing a lot of, sort of having a lot of positive effects. They're just not as good as we hoped them to be. So I want to address the question of why is that? And bear in mind that there's a lot of reasons behind carbon prices being too low. There's a great saying that nothing happens for a reason, everything happens for lots of reasons. But here I'm going to focus on one, and that is political constraints. So, as Bismarck said, politics is the art of the possible. and we can see this in sort of the real world experience of trying to put these systems into action. So Europe for a long time has been concerned about its low carbon price and actually tried to pass a lot of reforms to increase it. And the company that I was working for, we were actually involved with consulting lawmakers throughout this process. So I was fortunate to see a lot of this in action. So essentially what happened is around in the period from between 2012 and 2015, the European Union, the European Commission, and Parliament and Council, all these bodies, they were involved in reforming the market, more specifically with a system called the Market Stability Reserve. And this was, I don't want to get into specifics, but basically a way to increase the carbon price. Essentially what happened is there was a coalition of European member states, led by Poland, that formed, and essentially they collected enough votes in the European Council to be able to block any deal that would raise the carbon price too much. Why did they do that? Well, a lot of these Eastern European member states are based on coal and gas. Poland specifically has, most of its electricity comes from gas and has quite a sizable coal industry as well, or coal mining. So the same thing happened in the European Parliament. Certain factions within the Parliament, like the Industry Committee, generally pandered to sort of the interests of energy-intensive industries, which said that any increase in the carbon price would spell the end to their businesses. And one thing to underscore here is it's not because Europeans don't believe in climate change. They do. It's just that they think that if they have a high carbon price, but other countries don't, they're worried about their industries leaving Europe and going to the places that have low carbon prices. So that's the concern here. And essentially the end result was that all of these concerns resulted in weaker market reforms than would have happened otherwise. But Europe did eventually pass a reform to its carbon market, and currently we think that the carbon price is on the way up. How high will it go? Well, one of the projections that we made before I left was that in 2030 the carbon price would be about $30 a ton, or between 20 and 30. So, still not high enough to really solve climate change, right? If we look at the sort of benchmarks that I put up there. Interestingly enough, throughout this process, one of the lawmakers that worked on this from the Green Party in the European Parliament, he said this, he captured this very well by saying, there's a political constraint on how high the carbon price can be. And that's at around 20 to 30 euros a ton. And it just can't be higher because, businesses and lobbyists will essentially prevent it from happening. So, briefly going through Australia, this is actually my favorite case. If you think that climate policy doesn't get enough media attention, you would really get a kick out of Australia because the media was kind of talking about carbon pricing all the time there for a long period of time. And carbon pricing defined the careers of 3 different prime ministers. So it started with Kevin Rudd, who proposed a cap-and-trade system back in 2008. And long story short, essentially it was believed that the cap-and-trade system would hurt industry too much, even though there were a lot of exemptions and actually a lot of possibilities that industries would actually gain from the system. But eventually sort of, business interests coalesced around fighting against the proposal, and it eventually failed. So what this did is make Kevin Rudd very unpopular, and that sort of set the stage for Julia Gillard to replace him as Prime Minister. Now, Julia Gillard, what she tried to do is, again, implement the cap-and-trade system, and what happened is that she formed a coalition with the Green Party so that she can get a majority in Parliament, and the Green Party said, well, if you want our support, you need to start the cap-and-trade system with a period where the carbon price is fixed at $23 Australian dollars a ton. So she did that, and what happened later is that, well, the opposition party and sort of the media framed the cap-and-trade system as a carbon tax because the price on carbon was fixed in the beginning. And this whole kind of carbon tax debate was very actually problematic because Julia Gillard had promised during her election campaign not to raise any taxes. So she kind of acquired this nickname of Julia Gillard, and essentially this actually set the stage for her to lose the following election and Tony Abbott to win. Tony Abbott was from the Liberal Conservative Party, and he essentially campaigned on the idea of repealing the carbon tax. So the carbon tax essentially defined his campaign, and he won. And when he did, he repealed the cap and trade system. So I'm not saying that a carbon tax brought down the Australian government of Julia Gillard, but it was one of the main factors. So, going back to going to the Hillary campaign, Hillary had a lot of plans for how to tackle climate change. I'm not going to go through them now, but sort of one glaring omission was that she didn't actually support a carbon price. And according to emails leaked by WikiLeaks, they haven't been substantiated, but this is what they said is, according to the emails, John Podesta, who was the campaign manager, said that we have done extensive polling on a carbon tax, it all sucks. So again, we're not sure if he said that, but it's actually quite believable. So if we look at polls being done on climate policy, and look at sort of the lowest part, which is a carbon tax if revenues are used to refund every American household. How many people would support that? It's 44%. Now, interestingly, if we look at other climate policies, such as fund research into renewable energy sources, actually 77% of Americans support that policy. If we look at other ones like regulate CO2 as a pollutant, again, 74%. Interestingly, set a strict CO2 limit on existing coal-fired power plants. Again, majority, 63% of Americans. So, majority of Americans want the regulations on carbon price, on carbon emissions, but not carbon pricing. Even though carbon pricing is the most cost-effective way to reduce emissions. So, going back to why do oil companies support, can we take questions later? Going back to why, unless it's a quick clarifying thing.
It's on this slide, but we can come back to it.
Okay. So going back to oil companies, why do they say we want the global carbon price? Well, one reason is they want to appear progressive and they want to kind of, appear like they're playing along for, I think, media relations essentially, because they know that a carbon price is infeasible. If we look at the polls, if we look at the global experience, and the way that carbon pricing is very politically difficult, if you're an oil company, it's good public relations exercise to say we support something that sounds very good in theory and will never happen. So I think this is one of the main reasons why you see them doing it. Yeah, so why is carbon pricing so unpopular? Well, I think it goes back to essentially it's very difficult to raise energy prices. This has been kind of an anathema of policymakers for a very long time. Mexico, where I was just last week, recently raised the price of gasoline. Essentially what they did is they removed subsidies that they were giving to the gasoline market, to gasoline producers, sorry. And what happened is the price of gas went up by 20%. And there was a crisis in January, just this month, past month. There was looting on the streets. People died, unfortunately, a few of them. And there was widespread looting. And this is not unprecedented. In history, there are a lot of cases in which politicians have tried to raise the price of energy, and there have been massive protests. So kind of why, sort of a way to think about climate policy then from sort of a political economy perspective is if we have two dimensions. So on the horizontal axis we have either costs are invisible or costs are visible. And then on the vertical axis, sort of the lower quadrant is where benefits are relatively spread out, diffuse, and costs are very concentrated. And then, higher up, the opposite. So, I think talking about carbon pricing, it's essentially here. It essentially makes costs very visible. This is the carbon price. This is sort of what you should pay for every ton of emissions, right? And that's the idea. That's what economists love. But the problem then is, benefits are very diffuse. So a lot of people benefit, right? Every citizen on the planet benefits from climate policy. But the costs are very concentrated in very sort of few fossil fuel interests. And that's a big problem from a political economy perspective, creates collective action problems. It's very difficult for all of these diffuse beneficiaries to really organize and fight for these kind of policies. So if we look at some alternatives, if we look at a ban on coal, this is where costs are becoming visible. It's hard to tell how much does it cost the economy to do that. But again, sort of costs are very concentrated. And we can look at other policies like subsidies where, the benefits are very concentrated, but the costs are spread out and the costs are invisible. So the argument I'm trying to make here is, essentially, as you move up and to the left, we see policies that have a better and better chance of being passed, that are more and more politically feasible. But in the lower right quadrant are policies that make the most sense economically. So this is good economics, internalizing externalities, sort of making prices explicit. But this is great politics, is when you have a bunch of money and you can allocate it to special interests that are lobbying you or that are giving you campaign contributions. And sorry, another thing here is intensity wins in politics, right? So if the benefits are very concentrated, you're going to get those beneficiaries that get all the benefits lobbying for those policies. And if the costs are diffuse, then the people that lose a little bit, they're not going to sort of intensely organize and try to stop you. So that's why we see feed-in tariffs actually very popular around the world. Sort of one of the main ways that countries have so far implemented to support renewables, most notably in Europe, in Germany, in France, Denmark, also I think in California, we see that policy being implemented. So essentially, what's good economics is very, very difficult politics. So, but nothing that I'm saying should be a reason for cynicism or kind of to withdraw from policymaking and just say, I give up. Actually, I think quite the opposite. I think going back to this quote is, as Plato says, one of the penalties for refusing to participate in politics end up being governed by your inferiors, right? Maybe particularly relevant today in the US. So I actually think there's a lot of reason for hope. If we look at sort of a lot of the recent progress with the Paris Agreement of 2015, this is John Kerry signing it with his granddaughter in his lap. That's the first international agreement where all countries are actually committing efforts and saying we'll do something and we'll do more and more over time. The first, because the Kyoto Protocol didn't actually commit all countries, right, just developed ones. Then the Kigali Agreement in Rwanda, which happened in 2016, and essentially was a very major international agreement to phase out HFCs. And HFCs are greenhouse gases that are tens of thousands of times more potent than CO2. According to some estimates, the Kigali Agreement will mitigate climate change to an extent that is comparable to that of the Paris Agreement. So, very, very significant step forward. And also, there was a deal on limiting aviation emissions at the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, in 2016 in Montreal. So there's a lot of progress, and going back to the oil companies again, one reason I think that they supported carbon pricing is, besides of all the rest, is that they know that climate policy will happen at some point, inevitably, and that it will be more and more stringent over time. So they know that if they don't engage constructively, if they're not at the table, they're on the menu, right? And there's another reason as well. So a lot of oil companies actually have gas infrastructure and gas reserves, and they benefit from a carbon price because the carbon price makes coal less competitive than gas. So this is one example where carbon price actually benefits clean energy industry, and there might be beneficiaries and there might be industries that have in their self-interest, have in their sort of are incentivized to support these policies. So a lot of these, I think one of the main takeaways then is second best is not worse. So what I mean by that is sort of economists and climate policy experts talk a lot about second best policies. And what this means is, well, carbon pricing is the best policy, right, as we talked. But actually, if it's not politically feasible, there are a lot of alternative policies that might be second best, but they're actually feasible. We can actually implement them. So a lot of these things are subsidies, renewable portfolio standards, regulating the power sector, for instance, implementing things like real-time pricing, things that can actually help renewables be integrated into the system. If you want to know more about that, you should read MIT's future Utility of the Future study, which covers these things pretty well. There's a researcher at University of Berkeley, Jonas Meckling, who talks a lot about sort of a sequential approach to climate policy and saying that we need green industrial policy, essentially these things that I enumerated. We need that to happen first and create businesses that will later advocate for carbon pricing. Essentially, we need to create the industries that will benefit and that will be able to fight for carbon pricing to happen. So first, subsidize, have renewable portfolio standards, etc., and then price carbon, he says. And I think, kind of one of the conclusions from this talk is that makes sense. But, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that carbon pricing is not worth pursuing. As I said, carbon prices around the world have actually produced a lot of benefits. They have reduced a significant amount of emissions and brought annual revenues that are being invested in renewable energy, etc. If you look at California, in California, most of the policies being implemented, most of the emission reductions that are happening are actually coming from these second best policies. They're bringing more than 90% of all emission reductions in California. But California also has a carbon price. And the carbon price is, I think, very smart. It's modest. It's about $12 a ton. And it's politically feasible, and it's something that brings in revenues that they can reinvest into all of these second best approaches where they, support renewable and public transit industries. But when we talk about carbon pricing, the conclusion from this talk is, carbon pricing is difficult, right? So we should think of it as a journey. We should think of it as the strong and slow boring of hard boards, something that Hillary Clinton was very sort of fond of saying, right? It's difficult, so we should be open to the idea of accepting concessions. Maybe starting, if we're trying to implement a carbon price, maybe accepting the idea that at first it's not going to be perfect, but eventually we're going to fix it and improve it over time. So kind of employ sort of an incrementalist approach to carbon pricing. So, just one example, in Europe, the cap and trade system, the way that they managed to implement it at first was to give away all of the permits to the polluting industries. So free allocation of permits. So, this kind of thing, it limits the effectiveness of the system, but it means that you can bring in industry as, supporting stakeholders and actually implement it. So it's going to be slow and kind of incremental process. And I already said, kind of be open for concessions. Do not kind of make it perfect, then if you could. We saw that in Washington State, which actually tried to implement the carbon tax, as I mentioned. There was a carbon tax on the ballot in November, and it was kind of created this huge controversy in the environmental community because a lot of environmental groups actually didn't support it because it wasn't the policy they wanted. It wasn't perfect. So, and it failed. It got 42% support, which to me says that if the environmental community would have supported it wholeheartedly, it would have passed. And Washington State would have had the first carbon tax in the US. But that didn't happen because I think we made the perfect getting really good. So if there's one kind of takeaway, if you remember only one thing, let it be this. If we want for our research to be relevant, if we want our strategies to be successful, we should account for political feasibility. So let's, from time to time, put ourselves in the shoes of lawmakers, whose job it is to put our ideas into action. Thanks.
All right, so we have a couple minutes to take questions. I know there was one, definitely. So please.
Yeah. Can you go back to the bar chart about attitudes? So that big gray blob in the middle of the carbon tax would say to me that there's a huge population who doesn't have their mind made up, and so there's actually a big opportunity to really engage folks in these ideas.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, thank you. There's another caveat to this, is that other polls done by Michigan University have showed that there is a majority support for carbon pricing with a, sort of recycling the revenues back to households and
So revenue
taxpayers.
neutral.
Revenue neutral. However, the support that was found was 51%, so very slim margin. But yeah, I mean, there is potential, yeah.
Where'd you get the fantastic T-shirt?
So that's Citizens Climate Lobby, which is an organization that tries to promote a revenue-neutral carbon tax in the U.S. and around the world. I worked with them briefly while I was in Europe. So yeah. Anna?
When you had this slide about the sort of overall externality of carbon, does that include health effects from more pollution in the air? And if so, why isn't that more of a discussion? Because I know like with acid rain, everyone was very aware of negative health effects that were fairly immediate, as opposed to having to discount the benefits.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's not included in those estimates. So that would be in addition. So that's what economists call co-benefits of climate action, where you're not just mitigating climate change and getting those benefits of less climate change, you're also getting additional benefits in terms of clean air that would make more of a case for the policy. Just to quickly say, a lot of the reason why it's not talked about as much as climate benefits is partially that it's very difficult to quantify, and also partially that sort of policy wonks have this approach of one problem, one policy. So there's kind of a tendency not to think too much about sort of these synergies, even though I think we should think about them more.
In terms of early adapters, the green on one of your slides, those who have done some kind of policy, how have those countries done, or those geographies done economically these having adopted? Because that's big.
Yeah, quite well, actually. So British Columbia, I think I mentioned that. There have been studies trying to show the economic impact of the carbon tax that essentially showed that it is positive. A big part of that is because the money from the carbon tax is used to reduce other taxes. So actually it makes people richer and being able to spend more on other things. And that's what economists would love to see is, you would tax things that are bad and not things that are good, like work and income and things like that. Similar studies have been done in Scandinavia where there have been carbon taxes for a long time, so we've been studying them for a long time, and they've shown that generally there's a positive economic benefit as well, partially for the same reasons. Shreyas?
When all these stakeholders are trying to decide what the right amount to emit is, whether it's industrial plants or whether it's whoever it is, whoever the participating units are, they need to model their own actions and try to see what their optimum emissions are. So, but this doesn't happen everywhere, and there are inefficiencies that are introduced because some people emit more than what they should and pay out more, and some people don't. So, how does this work out in real in your experience? Do people do these participating units? Do they somehow figure out the right amounts to emit? I mean, there are consulting firms which do this, but what about the rest?
Yeah, there are a lot of small companies being covered by a lot of these carbon prices, and they generally have no clue what to do. Oftentimes, their focus is make sure we're complying with the policy, and that's it. So, yeah, there's a lot of inefficiency, but it's relatively small. So the major emitters are usually big companies that sort of have resources, and what happens is they hire a whole teams of people that are actually just carbon experts within the company that are doing that. But you could argue that even they are not taking all the actions that they should be taking theoretically because of bounded rationality and things like principal agent problems. So maybe they identify an energy efficiency measure that can save them money and make them money by selling carbon permits, but they can't do it because the management wants to allocate capital somewhere else.
Getting back to the first question, what would your one or two sentence argument be for the people who haven't formed an opinion about carbon pricing? How would you convince them, particularly people without an economics background,
How would I convince them of what?
that they should support carbon pricing?
Well, carbon pricing is sort of the most elegant, effective, cost-effective way of addressing climate change. It's the cheapest way because once you set a price on carbon, you let participants, you let companies decide how they're going to reduce emissions. And that takes a lot of decision-making out of government and into the private sector, which usually has more information and can actually, the market can make a more efficient decision. So at the end of the day, we're going to solve climate change at a lower cost. Economically speaking, it's a very huge argument for carbon pricing because it's simply a lot cheaper to reduce emissions that way.